They thought I was deaf, senile, and out of my mind. I was sitting quietly in my old recliner, pretending to nap, while my grandson and his friends whispered just a few feet away. They were talking about robbing the neighbor's house. My sweet neighbors, the Hendersons, who always brought me cookies on holidays. My own grandson, the boy I used to rock to sleep, was leading the conversation. And then, as if that wasn't enough, he reached into my purse, took a couple $100, and took a selfie with me, his sleeping old grandma, like it was some kind of joke. If you're ready for this journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this a like so you don't miss the updates. And let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. It's always lovely to see where everyone is. You know, people assume that getting old means getting foolish, but they forget one thing. We've seen things. We've lived. And when you've lived through a few decades of heartache and nonsense, you start to recognize evil, even when it's wearing your grandson's favorite hoodie. That afternoon, the house was quiet except for the boys' muffled voices. I'd been knitting, something simple to keep my hands busy, and I could hear every word. They thought I couldn't. My hearing aids were on the side table, so they assumed I wasn't wearing them. But I've learned to read lips better than they could ever imagine. Old Bat doesn't understand a thing, my grandson, Jason, said. We'll go in through the Hendersons' back window. They're at bingo till 9. His friend Kyle laughed. What about cameras? Don't worry, they don't have any. I checked last week when I mowed their lawn. And that's when my heart sank. My sweet, trusting neighbors, he'd been watching them like a thief casing a bank. I sat still. My pulse was hammering, but I didn't move a muscle. I let them think I was asleep, just another worn-out old lady who couldn't tell night from day. When they finally went outside, laughing and joking, I went straight to my kitchen phone. My hands were trembling, but my mind was clear as day. Hello, officer? I said when the dispatcher answered. I think there's about to be a break-in on Maple Street, number 42, the Hendersons' house. I gave them all the details, what the boys planned, how they'd enter, what time. The officer sounded skeptical at first, but when I mentioned Jason's name, he sighed. We know him, ma'am. We'll take care of it. It broke my heart. My grandson's name was already known at the police station. By evening, I could see the blue and red lights flashing a few blocks away. But that wasn't all. Before the boys could even try their little heist, I had one more thing to do. I walked, yes, walked, down the street, my cane tapping the pavement, and left a handwritten note on the Hendersons' front door. Just one word: run. They might not have understood it right away, but when they saw the squad cars later that night, I'm sure they did. The next morning, Jason came home furious. He slammed the door so hard, my wall clock rattled. Someone tipped him off. The cops were waiting for us. I didn't even blink. I just sipped my tea and said, "Oh, that's a shame." He glared at me, eyes narrowing. You didn't even notice we were gone, did you, Grandma? I smiled. Of course not, dear. I was fast asleep. He rolled his eyes and stormed off to his room, muttering curses under his breath. What he didn't know was that I had the police officer's card tucked safely under my saucer. They told me they were investigating, that they might need me to testify if things escalated. And something in my gut told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A few days later, Jason started acting different, quieter, nervous. He stopped bringing his friends around for a while, which I thought was a good sign. But then, about 2 weeks later, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. He was back at it. This time, it wasn't a house he wanted. It was a car. He didn't know I was in the kitchen washing dishes when he whispered into his phone, "We'll stash it in Grandma's garage. She won't even know. It's perfect." I dropped the dish towel right into the sink. Perfect. Oh, honey, you have no idea. And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me, because you'll want to see how this plays out.
I called Officer Harris again. "Ma'am, it's you again," he said with a chuckle. "What's going on this time?" I told him everything. The plan, the timing, even the make of the car Jason mentioned. The officer sighed but said, "All right, we'll have a team nearby. Just keep doing what you're doing." So, I did. That weekend, Jason and his two friends showed up around midnight, whispering and giggling like they were in some bad heist movie. They pulled into my driveway with a shiny black car I didn't recognize. Later, I'd learned it was stolen from a dealership 2 towns over. I pretended to be asleep again, the same way as before. They parked it in the garage, closed the door, and high-fived like idiots. And not 30 seconds later, flashlights, sirens, voices shouting, "Police, hands up!" I didn't even have to leave my chair. When the officers hauled Jason and his friends out, one of them looked at me and said softly, "You've got good instincts, ma'am." I nodded. Just doing what a grandma does, keeping an eye on her boy. Jason looked at me, wide-eyed and furious as they put him in the back of the car. "You did this," he spat. I met his glare calmly. "No, sweetheart, you did this." The trial took a few months. I won't lie. It broke my heart to sit there, watching him in that orange jumpsuit, still looking at me like I was the enemy. But when the judge handed down the verdict, something unexpected happened. Jason didn't get jail time. The judge said, "Given the defendant's age and family circumstances, I'm sentencing him to probation, community service, and requiring him to live under the supervision of his grandmother." The courtroom went silent. Even I was speechless. He didn't realize it yet, but that sentence, that was the best thing that could have happened to either one of us. He thought he was getting a second chance, but what he didn't know was that I was getting one too. The day the court made me Jason's guardian, I wore my church shoes and a cardigan with pearl buttons. I wanted to look like the kind of woman who could be trusted with a wayward boy and still make a decent pot roast. But inside, I felt like I'd been handed an unassembled lawnmower without the manual. The probation officer, a square-shouldered woman named Alvarez, ran through the rules in a clipped voice. Curfew at 8 p.m., weekly check-ins, no contact with co-defendants, random drug tests, school attendance mandatory or work with verification, and community service shifts assigned through the county. Then she turned to me. "Mrs. Carter, as guardian, you'll enforce all of this. If he violates, you call me. If you don't call me, you'll be in front of the same judge." "Understood," I said. I didn't blink. Jason shuffled beside me, scowling at the floor. Probation looked a lot like a leash to him, and a short one. He signed the papers with a dramatic sigh that would have earned him an eye roll in my old PTA meetings, and we drove home in a silence so full you could have hung curtains on it. I had prepared for this moment, believe me. The weekend before sentencing, while the lawyers argued and I baked banana bread to keep my hands from shaking, I turned my guest room into a landing pad for a lost astronaut. Fresh sheets, no electronics except an alarm clock, a desk with a bright lamp, and a corkboard with a tidy row of index cards labeled with the days of the week. On each card, I'd pinned a schedule: wake up, breakfast, chores, community service, school or work hours, dinner, study time, and lights out. I even drew little boxes he could check off. Years of raising kids and then tutoring at the library had taught me one thing: people resist change less when they can measure it. The first night, I set a casserole on the table and slid a folder across to him like it was a secret mission. "What's this?" he asked flatly. I said, "Your contract. House rules." He snorted. "A contract? I'm not signing."
Great, I said, cheery as spring tulips. Then I'll call Officer Alvarez and you can explain why you refused to comply with a court-appointed guardian. I took out the little flip phone Alvarez had given me. It wasn't much smarter than a toaster, but it had her number speed-dialed like a nuclear launch code. He stared at me, weighing it. He'd expected soft. He'd expected fragile. He hadn't expected me. He took the pen, scrawled his name, and pushed the folder back like it was a dead fish. "Thank you," I said. "Now, please set the table." He looked at the table, looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of the boy I'd loved since he fit in the crook of my arm. He grabbed the plates. "Yes, ma'am."
The contract was simple but thorough. No friends over without permission, no car keys at all. No cash beyond an allowance card loaded with exactly $25 per week, and receipts required for every penny above that. He'd pay me back the $200 he'd taken from my wallet at a rate of $10 per week, and that repayment would be the first line item in his new budget. If he wanted extras, he could earn them by ticking off squares on his corkboard for chores and study hours. Old-fashioned gamification, if you will. He hated it. He complied anyway. I won't tell you it was cute. It wasn't. The first 2 weeks were prickly, brittle things. Jason kept testing the edges of the fence. He was late for curfew on the second night by 9 minutes. I was on the porch with my flip phone like Clint Eastwood with a coffee mug. "You're late," I said. He argued. I dialed. He watched me put the phone to my ear and folded faster than a lawn chair in July. After that, he was home at 7:58 like a Swiss train. He tried to sneak his phone back from the plastic bin where we kept electronics after 9 p.m. I moved the bin into my bedroom closet, top shelf, next to a jar of peppermints and my wedding photos. He stopped testing that one when he realized the closet door had a jingle bell tied to the knob like it was Christmas. Subtle? No. Effective? Very. He refused to speak to the Hendersons, my neighbors he'd planned to rob, even though I invited them for coffee. I didn't push it. Not yet. The heart takes longer than the hands to learn new habits. What I did do was make him show up. Every community service shift, every check-in, every restorative justice circle session the county hosted at the library, where teenagers who'd stolen bikes and shoplifted candy bars sat in a ring and talked to the people they'd hurt. He sat stiff and silent in those first meetings, jaw locked, eyes flicking from the volunteer facilitator to the fluorescent lights, like he'd rather be anywhere else. That was fine. I didn't need his epiphany. I needed a routine. Routine is the scaffolding you hang better choices on. Meanwhile, I got to work on my end. The legal revenge, the social kind, the kind your pastor would still shake your hand for on Sunday. If motherhood is logistics, grandmotherhood is reconnaissance. I went through mail he'd tossed, found a scrap of paper with a username, and checked every social platform he might have used. I'm not a hacker, heaven help me, but I know how to read. The boys had been sloppy. He and his friends, Kyle and a third one he called Red, Matthew on his birth certificate I later learned, had a private group chat. Jason had screenshots saved in his backup account that synced to a cloud account he didn't even know existed. Do you know how many teenagers understand their phone settings? Right, about as many as can thread a needle. I didn't snoop to be nosy. I snooped to be safe. I printed what mattered, dated it, put it in a manila envelope, and typed a neat little summary on my old Dell desktop with the big square monitor. Then I marched it down to Officer Alvarez's office and handed it to her like a PTA report. She scanned the stack, eyebrows up. "You did all this yourself?" I said. "Ma'am, I survived dial-up internet and 3 bouts of chickenpox under one roof. You think a cloud account scares me?" She laughed, then sobered. "We can't use most of this in court without appropriate warrants, but it helps us know where to look. And it gives me leverage when I talk to the boys." She leaned forward. "You did the right thing." That night, Jason clattered into the kitchen after his shift at the county grounds, smelling like cut grass and damp socks. He opened the fridge. "Where's the soda?" I held up a pitcher of iced tea, replaced with water and tea. Sugar is a treat, not a staple. You want soda? We'll buy it with your allowance. He rolled his eyes and poured tea. "You can't control everything, Grandma."
Oh, I can't. But I can control everything in this house. And right now, this house is your lifeboat. I nodded towards the corkboard. You're close to earning a Saturday pass. 2 hours at the rec center if you finish your homework and your service hours this week. He snorted. 2 hours? Wow. Son, I said softly, when the choice is between 2 hours of freedom and none, 2 is gold.
He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. 2 weeks later, the rec center pass dangled like a carrot, and he took it grudgingly. He played half court, came home sweaty and almost smiling, then remembered he was supposed to be angry, and stomped past me like he was auditioning for a tantrum. I pretended not to notice and set a plate of leftover meatloaf on the stove. Progress rarely looks like progress until it stacks up. Around then, the neighborhood started to thaw toward us, mostly because I made sure we weren't invisible. I baked lemon bars for the Hendersons, carried them over, and apologized for the 10th time. I can't excuse what he did, I said, but I can invite you to judge him by what he does now. Would you consider letting him mow your lawn for the rest of the summer, free of charge? Mr. Henderson, a retired machinist with hands like tree roots, looked from me to Jason, who stood there like a fence post, and then back to me. He'll show up every Saturday? He will, I said, or he won't enjoy the luxury of my silence. We shook on it. Jason's eyes sliced toward me. Later he hissed, You volunteered me for them? Yes, I said. You were going to take their piece. You can start by giving some back. He showed up that Saturday at 8 a.m. sharp, with the mower and a stiff jaw. I watched from my porch, not like a hawk, more like a lighthouse. He didn't wave, he did the yard. When he finished, Mrs. Henderson brought him lemonade. He almost refused it, then took it, mumbled thanks, drank it in 3 gulps, and left the empty glass on their porch rail. Next week, he returned the glass before he started. The week after that, he fixed their sagging gate latch without being told. Mrs. Henderson told me in the produce aisle, whispering like it was a scandal. He used his own allowance to buy the new screws. I nodded and picked up a head of lettuce. I'm making BLTs tonight, I said casually. I'll make extra. The boys' co-defendants hovered like bad weather. Kyle started texting again. Red sent messages from a new number, asking to hang. Jason ignored them at first, then slipped once and answered, because anger is a gravity you have to fight every day. I saw the notifications because I'd set his phone to mirror to that cloud, and it pinged my email whenever he changed an app setting. He didn't know, he hadn't noticed the little backup on toggle I'd slid while he was at school. Don't worry, I wasn't reading his love notes. I was watching for wolves. When the messages turned from hang to one last job to easy money, I printed them and dropped them again into Officer Alvarez's inbox. She called their parents, called their bosses, called what needed to be called. Within a week, Kyle had family obligations that kept him busy. Red lost his job washing dishes after his manager found a vape in his apron. Consequences, boomerang style. Jason sulked, then got bored. Boredom is a dangerous ocean, so I built a dock. I signed him up for a Saturday morning car clinic at the community college, the kind that teach you how to change oil, patch a tire, and not get fleeced by a mechanic. You want to drive someday? Start by learning how a car works. He dragged his feet to the first class and came home with grease on his hands and a spark in his eye, which he hid behind sarcasm because he's 18 and allergic to sincerity. I could do this, he muttered, almost to himself, like as a job. I said, rinsing lettuce. Speak up, son. Nothing. Okay, I said, as if the idea wasn't already settling somewhere warm inside me. We were, believe it or not, getting somewhere. He had routines, responsibilities, and a grudging sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't a villain in a movie he couldn't control. And then, because life likes to test your progress right when you start to feel steady, a crack formed right down the middle of our fragile piece. It started with a photo. Of course it did. These boys document their poor decisions like it's an art project. I found it by accident while I was looking up a recipe for blueberry muffins, and a notification popped up in the corner of my screen, the cloud account again. The photo was a mirror selfie taken in a gas station bathroom. Jason wasn't in it.
Kyle was, along with two older guys I didn't recognize. One had a neck tattoo shaped like a crown, the other had a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and a sweatshirt from a custom auto body shop across town. The caption on the photo said, "Tonight we eat."
I printed it, circled the sweatshirt logo, and pointed a ruler at the crown tattoo like a school marm with a chart. That crown meant something. I'd seen it on a flyer taped to a light pole near the bus stop. A crew, they called themselves, which is a flattering word for a roving mess. I called Alvarez. She called a detective. The detective, a man with salt at his temples and patience in his smile, visited my living room with a notebook and a respectful nod to the quilt on my couch. "We appreciate your help, Mrs. Carter," he said. "We've been trying to get the older boys, the ones pulling strings. Your grandson is small fish. They like small fish." "Then let's starve them," I said. He smiled like he'd been waiting for a grandmother to say it out loud. We came up with a plan as clean and legal as a freshly laundered sheet. No entrapment, no theatrics, just documentation and inconvenience. I added a motion sensor camera above my garage, clearly visible, thank you very much, with a polite little yard sign that said "Smile." I printed a new set of neighborhood watch flyers and walked them door to door, reintroducing myself to every neighbor, looking them in the eye, saying firmly, "If you see strange cars idling, call me and call the police." I asked the Hendersons if Jason might help them catalog their valuables for insurance purposes and photograph serial numbers. "It's a good lesson," I said, "and it sends a message." Jason balked. "They don't need me going through their stuff. You'll do it with them in the room," I said. "You'll be the camera guy, not the picker." He glared, then looked at Mr. Henderson's arthritic fingers and said yes. I also started a paper trail only a grandmother would think to keep. Receipts for everything. His allowance reloads, his bus pass, the oil he bought for his mower, a pack of deck screws, even the lemon bar's ingredients. I put them in a binder with tabs. If anyone ever asked me where he was on a given day, I could show them time-stamped proof he was hauling my trash can to the curb at 7:12 a.m. One of the older boys might get slick, I'd be slicker. And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me, because you'll want to see how this plays out. The test came on a drizzly Thursday. Jason was scheduled for community service at the garden lot behind the library, turning compost and hating every second of it. I was at home, kneading bread, when Kyle's name flashed on my email alert from the cloud. Message preview. Hit tonight. Easy. Grandma's asleep. The timestamp said 5:41 p.m. The plan, bold as brass, was to meet in the alley by the auto shop across town, the same logo from the sweatshirt. The target, a locked yard with cars waiting for parts. They weren't going to steal a whole car, not this time. They were going to strip one. Easier, quieter, meaner. I called Alvarez. She looped in the detective. "We've had complaints about that shop," he said, carefully. "The owner's tied to the older boys. We can't go in without cause, but if they commit a crime on the property, then you can go in," I finished. That's right. I went to the garden lot with a picnic basket like I was a nice grandma bringing her boy a sandwich, because I am, and because it gave me an excuse to look him in the eye. He stood there in a neon vest, damp hair stuck to his forehead, hands buried wrist-deep in compost like payback. I handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and said calmly, low so only he could hear, "Do not go out tonight." He blinked. "What?" I repeated, pronouncing each word like a separate sentence. "Do not go out tonight. If your friends ask, you say your grandma is strict and your probation is stricter. You say no, you stay home." Something flickered behind his eyes. Fear or defiance, I couldn't tell. "How do you—" "I'm old, not foolish," I said. "Finish your shift. Be home by 6:30. We'll watch that documentary you picked about the planets." He squinted. "I didn't pick." "You did," I said, and patted his arm, leaving a little flower handprint on his neon sleeve, a lighthouse mark. 6:30. He came home at 6:28. He hovered in the kitchen, restless energy vibrating off him like a tuning fork. He texted once, thumbs moving fast, then put the phone face down like it weighed a ton. We watched the documentary. He didn't absorb a single star, I'd wager, but he sat next to me on the couch. His knee bounced, he drank tea, he checked the door when a car passed outside. Dogs barked down the street around 8:15. The documentary ended at 9. Curfew swallowed him whole.
At 9:42, the detective called. "We got him," he said simply. "Older boys and Kyle, not your grandson. We're at the shop now." I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding since I was 23. Jason heard the tone in my voice and sat forward. "What?" "They were arrested," I said. "Your friends, the older boys. You stayed home." His face did something I can't describe without tearing up even now. Relief and anger and shame and grief crowded into one expression, then scrambled to get out. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't go." "No," I said, "you didn't." He rubbed his face with both hands like he could wipe off the year. "They're going to blame me." "They might," I said, "but you don't have to accept the blame. You can accept responsibility. That looks different." He nodded, shaky. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, "Will you stay up with me a little?" "Of course," I said. "I'll make hot chocolate. Real kind, with the good cocoa." We sat at the kitchen table and drank chocolate and didn't say much. Sometimes words are too clunky for a tender moment. Sometimes you just listen to the refrigerator hum and let the night take care of the rest. The next morning, Alvarez called. "I'm proud of him," she said, "and I'm proud of you." Then, with that careful probation officer voice, "There's gonna be blowback. The older boys don't like loose ends. Keep your doors locked. Call me if you see unfamiliar cars." "My doors have been locked since 1979, I said, "but I'll keep an eye out." We entered a new phase after that. Quiet, watchful, deliberate. Jason's shoulders dropped a fraction. He started talking to me at breakfast. Little things at first. "Mrs. Graham says I'm good at the trimmer. The garden lot has a robin's nest. The Hendersons said their granddaughter's wedding is this fall." I nodded, tucked each scrap into my heart. One afternoon, he came home with grease on his knuckles and a folded brochure in his pocket. Community College Automotive Program. He slid it onto the counter like it might explode. "They have night classes," he said. "Alvarez said it could count toward my community service if I log the hours and volunteer with the county fleet on Saturdays." I picked up the brochure. The paper smelled like hope and toner. I said, "That sounds like a plan. A real one." He stood there, waiting. For permission? For blessing? For proof I believed in something beyond lawn mowing and lemon bars? I wiped my hands on a towel and looked him square in the eye. I said, "I will help you fill this out. I will drive you to the placement test. I will pack you a sandwich." He swallowed and nodded. "Okay." We filled out the application that night at the kitchen table, the same table where a month earlier I'd laid down a contract like a gauntlet. Now we were laying down a path. But don't think the universe was going to let us stroll to redemption arm in arm with violins playing. No. 2 days later, a message appeared on the cloud account from a number not in his contacts. No name. Just a crown emoji and an address. Then, "You snitched." Then, "We're not done." I felt cold all the way to my ankles. I printed it, circled the crown, put it in the manila envelope, called Alvarez. She said, "We'll add a note to his file. If you see anything, call 911. The detective requested I not engage, not reply. "We'll find him through the number," he said. "Let us handle it." So, I handled what I could control, which was my house. I bought motion lights for the side yard. I asked the Hendersons to park in their driveway instead of on the street for a week. I baked more lemon bars because anxiety is a battery and sugar is a wire. I told Jason plainly, "Someone messaged you. You're not in trouble,
but you're not to reply. Block, report, hand me the phone if they try again. He nodded, jaw set. I'm not going back. And it wasn't defiance this time. It was a promise to himself. That Saturday, we went to the farmer's market. He carried the tote bags without complaining. An older man selling tomatoes recognized him because small towns have memories like elephants. The man narrowed his eyes, then glanced at me, then at Jason again. I watched my grandson stand a little straighter. Sir, he said, and held the man's gaze. I messed up, and I'm working on it. He handed over cash for a pound of tomatoes. The man gave a tight nod and bagged them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was a start. The Restorative Justice Circle invited Jason to speak the following week, not as a confessor, but as a cautionary tale. He resisted naturally. No teenager wants to narrate his worst parts to a room full of folding chairs. I didn't push. I simply reminded him, you stole my money and sat on my couch and planned to hurt good people. You can sit in a circle and try to help someone else not do the same thing.
He went. He spoke. I know because Mrs. O'Malley from the library called me afterward to tell me she'd cried. He said his grandma put bells on the closet, she said, voice wobbly. And he said he was grateful. When he came home, he was embarrassed and a little raw. I made grilled cheese. We ate in silence. After, he rinsed his plate and said, I didn't say your name. I know, I said. I'm still proud of you. What he didn't know, what I wasn't ready to tell him, was that I was working on one more layer of justice, the financial kind that stitches things closed. I'd been talking to the Hendersons about a quiet arrangement. Jason would repay a community debt beyond my $200. We calculated the cost of their new security system, the increased insurance premium after the attempted break-in, the hours Mr. Henderson spent installing lights. We came up with a number that made my eyes widen and my heart feel generous and strict at the same time. I opened a savings account in Jason's name with me as custodian. We labeled it amends. Every paycheck from his grounds crew job, 15% went into amends. Every chore bonus, 10% into amends. Every scholarship dollar he might someday earn, well, we'd cross that bridge when we came to it, but the envelope had a slot ready. I didn't present it as punishment. I presented it as a map to redemption. The day I showed him the ledger, he blinked at the number and whispered, "That's a lot." "Yes," I said. "So was what you almost did." He traced the column headers with his finger. Date, amount, balance. He nodded once, slow. "Okay." We were inching towards something like stability when the Crown boys decided to rattle the cage. Late one evening, just before curfew, a car idled at the corner, bass low and menacing. Jason froze in the doorway. I stepped onto the porch with my flip phone and my church lady stare, the one that can curdle milk. The car slid away, but not before I memorized the first 3 letters on the plate and the dent on the rear bumper. I called 911, I gave the plate. The operator asked a few questions and said a cruiser would pass by. I thanked her and went back inside. Jason was pale, but he didn't shake. He just closed the door and slid the chain. "I hate them," he said softly. "I don't have to hate them," I said, surprising both of us. "You just have to make them irrelevant to your future." He breathed out, shaky. "How?" "By building one they can't fit inside." That night, I put the manila envelope at the back of the freezer, behind the frozen peas, an old habit from the days when I didn't trust that fireproof meant foolproof. I made a second copy and put it in a safe deposit box at the credit union. I am a soft woman. I am not a fool. Days lengthened. The garden lot bloomed nasturtiums and tomatoes. Jason finished his grounds crew shifts for the season and started the automotive program. He came home smelling like engine cleaner and pride. The Hendersons' lawn looked like a magazine ad. Once I caught him sitting on the porch steps after mowing, talking to Mr. Henderson about torque wrenches like they were discussing literature. I went back inside and cried into the dish towel, quiet, ridiculous tears that tasted like gratitude. And just when you think the second act is winding toward peace, you should know, the story wasn't done with us yet. There was one more hinge we hadn't opened, one more door the past had leaned against. It came, as these things often do, disguised as good news. Jason's advisor at the community college called me to tell me he'd qualified for a small workforce grant. She said, "It's not much, but it will cover his lab fees and give him a stipend for tools." She suggested he pick out a starter tool set from a local supplier. The one with the best reviews was, wouldn't you know it, across town, near the auto shop where the older boys had been arrested. I debated. Do we avoid that part of town like it's haunted, or do we walk in with our heads high and our receipts ready? I chose receipts. I said, we'll go together. In daylight. We'll bide your tools. We'll keep our eyes open. He nodded, braced. We drove over on a Saturday morning, sunshine pooling on the pavement, people moving like a city at peace with its errands. We parked in front of the tool supplier, a clean storefront with a bell that dinged when we opened the door. The clerk was friendly and didn't flinch at Jason's last name when he filled out the warranty card. We left with a box that looked like a treasure chest, winches and sockets, and a torque bar that felt like a promise. As we walked back to the car, a voice slithered out from the alley. Well, well. Jason stiffened. I turned, slow. The man with the crown tattoo leaned against a dumpster, arms crossed, smiles sharp. Heard you're a schoolboy now, he said to Jason. Cute. Jason didn't speak. Good. Silence is a weapon if you know how to hold it. Crown tattoo smirked at me. You the famous grandma? I met his eyes. I am. You like calling cops? I like protecting my home, I said, and my grandson. He took a step forward, then stopped. His gaze flicked to the street, where a patrol car rolled by at a grandmotherly pace. He chuckled, but it sounded forced. Probation won't last forever, old lady. Then what? Then, I said, lowering my voice so only he could hear, he'll be busy living a life that doesn't include you. I tilted my head. You ever had a grandmother love you so much it rearranged your bones? Something passed across his face. Confusion, maybe even a flash of envy. He spat on the ground, muttered something uncreative, and slunk back into the alley. Jason let out a breath like he'd been holding it since dawn. I thought, I know. Let's go home. On the drive back, he stared out the window for a long time. Then, softly, thanks. For what? For, choosing me, he said, as if the words were heavy. I squeezed the steering wheel. Always. We pulled into the driveway to find a small package on the porch. No return address, just our house number in block letters. I felt my stomach drop. Jason went pale. I put the car in park and said, don't touch it. We called the non-emergency line. A patrol officer arrived, opened it with practiced care. Inside, a single spark plug and a note. This one's yours. The officer bagged it, took a statement, promised to loop in the detective. Jason stood in the kitchen after they left, staring at the indentation the box had left on the doormat. They're not gonna stop, he said. Not a question. They'll stop when it's boring, I said, and we're going to make it very, very boring. How? By doing exactly what we've been doing, showing up, logging hours, mowing lawns, passing classes, saving money in amends. Boring is unbeatable. He cracked the smallest smile. You're scary, you know that? Good. I've been working on it. We ate dinner, BLTs, like I'd promised weeks back. And as he washed dishes, I watched his shoulders square themselves to a future he was choosing one chore at a time. It wasn't dramatic.
It wasn't cinematic. It was better. It was real. I wish I could tell you the Crown Boys evaporated or repented. They didn't, but the edges of our life hardened against them like a well-seasoned skillet. The soft places were still soft. Movie nights, grilled cheese, and the way Jason laughed with his whole face when the cat tried to catch a laser pointer. But the boundaries, those were iron, and iron holds. We were building toward a reckoning I hadn't fully planned, one involving courtrooms and clipboards and a stack of receipts so tall it could give a man a nosebleed. But that's part 3. He was about to get exactly what he deserved, and I had a front row seat. Don't go anywhere. If you told me the night I first heard them plotting in my living room that 3 years later, I'd be the one standing in my driveway, watching my grandson being led away in handcuffs again, I might have laughed, then cried, then laughed some more. Life has a way of writing twists you don't expect and neat little ironies you don't deserve. But here we were. After the tool store incident, things had been mostly steady. Jason was in night classes, hauling himself through lab practicals and quizzes like a stubborn, determined mule. He took pride in learning how an engine could purr instead of cough like a bad uncle at Thanksgiving. He worked extra hours on the county grounds crew, saved religiously into amends, and, most importantly, kept his head down when the Crown Boys prowled. I thought we were safe. Then, one late summer afternoon, as the air went from thick to forgiving and the hydrangeas started to show their blues, Jason's behavior changed in a way that made my teeth ache. He was quieter, not the steady quiet of someone learning patience, but the skittish, furtive quiet of someone holding a secret too heavy for his shoulders. He checked his phone with the kind of frequency normally reserved for teenagers in the throes of a crush. He took calls in the backyard, voice low. He left the house at odd hours and returned with pockets full of cigarette butts, or that's what I thought at first.
I tried to chalk it up to stress, midterms, labs, the grind. I made him stews and left notes on his pillow, tiny, old lady pep talks, and he read them, sometimes smudging the ink with greasy thumbs. But one evening, something slipped. It was a small thing, a hasty text not meant for me, but seen because he'd set the phone on the counter and walked away humming like a man who'd just convinced himself of something dangerous. The preview popped on my screen. "Tonight, hit the lot, Grandma's asleep," it said. My hands tightened around my mug until the porcelain protested. I did what I'd done before. I logged, I printed, I called Alvarez and the detective. I showed them the message. They already had the number in their system from the men they'd arrested months earlier. They asked if I could keep Jason at home that night, be his anchor. I said I would. You remember the locking of the closet, the jingle bell trick, the corkboard? Those things were not theater. They were scaffolding. They worked until they didn't. That night, Jason came home later than usual. He dropped his backpack and moved like a man with a shadow at his heels. He murmured something about extra lab time, and then, before I could issue the standard curfew, Alvarez, consequences speech, he blurted, "Grandma, and then closed the door and went to his room. I stood there like a telephone pole struck by lightning. I knocked, went in, and found him sitting on the edge of the bed with his face in his hands. He looked up when I sat beside him. "I'm sorry," he said, almost a sob. "I didn't mean—" "You what, Jason?" I asked. "Tell me the whole truth." He took a deep breath, the kind that comes before a confession. "I thought it would be easy. I thought I could do one thing, hide it, and nobody would get hurt." He looked at me like he'd found the word he'd been searching for. "It was supposed to be like that selfie. Funny. A joke. I didn't mean to—" His voice broke. He made a fist and let it go. I listened. There's a rhythm to these things, and you learn to catch it. He told me haltingly that he'd been hanging around with Kyle again more than he'd admit. They'd met guys who promised quick money, jobs that sounded like work but were really lures. He swore he'd only gone to look once to see if he could help move a car short distances for cash. He said he'd never touched anything, never driven the car. He said he'd only agreed to keep watch. Keep watch where, I asked, because sometimes a person's vocabulary is small when they're guilty and huge when they're lying. He said he'd only agreed to keep watch. Keep watch where, I asked, because sometimes a person's vocabulary is small when they're guilty and huge when they're lying. At a place that passed the auto shop, he said, the lot behind Holcomb's. They said they could stash it in. He stopped, face going white. They said we could hide it in your garage. My stomach dropped. Who told you that? Red, Matthew, he whispered. I felt the world tilt. The boys had been bold, but they'd also forgotten the single most dangerous thing, my house. My garage was large and often empty during the day because I loved my garden and my porch and not much else. It was the kind of place people assume nobody watches. They thought I was old. They thought I was asleep. He looked at me, eyes full of shame. He said, I didn't want to put you through it, Grandma. I didn't want to drag you into it. I said, you've already dragged me, but my voice was soft. You need to tell the police right now. He spat like the idea of betraying his friends made him sick. They'll what? I demanded. Blame you? Maybe, but I promise you this. If you're truthful, you'll have me up there with you. If you stay quiet and do what they ask, you'll be back in a place where the judge asks why you bothered having a grandmother at all. He sat in the silence for a while, chewing his knuckle like a man deciding between two bitter pills. Finally, he nodded. Call Alvarez, tell her everything. I'll show her the messages. So I did. We went to the precinct together. My heart felt like a small animal trapped in a paper bag. Alvarez didn't blink. She listened to him without surprise and without judgment, like a woman who'd learned that teenagers are often both victims and architects of their own misfortune. She coordinated a careful sting, the kind that looks planned because it is planned, with surveillance and marked patrols and officers positioned where they could sweep in without turning the scene into a blood sport. She told him, we'll take every precaution, but you'll need to cooperate fully. He agreed, with teeth clenched and hands on his knees. I held his hand as they explained things. I felt ridiculous and righteous and terrified all at once. My chest tightened so hard, it felt like my ribs were remembered wrong. The night they planned the move, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with the lamp low and the television off. I had the detective's number 6 times speed dialed, 3 bottles of water, 2 flashlights, an emergency whistle, and a very stubborn belief that things would turn out the way they were supposed to. My neighbors peeked over the fence, a polite assemblage of worry. I gave them nods like semaphore. Then the phone buzzed. Alvarez's voice. They're moving tonight. Are you ready? As I'll ever be, I answered. The plans were as cold and efficient as a legal pad. The officers trailed the boys from the lot, surveilling from 2 blocks over. The plan was for the boys to drive the stolen car, one of those luxury sedans ripped from a dealer in the next county, up to my street, creep into my driveway, pull into my garage, and leave it there while they disappeared into the night. The officers would move in when the garage door closed and the boys thought themselves safe. If you asked me whether I was frightened, I'd tell you yes. If you asked whether I thought it was necessary, I'd tell you with the certainty of a widow who's paid property taxes most of her life, absolutely. At 10:12 p.m., headlights rolled onto my street. I watched from the blinds as a sleek black car eased in my driveway like a cat that thinks the porch is hers. My heart hammered. The driver, one of the older boys the detective had been watching, moved like someone who believed he was untouchable. The garage door clicked up, and they nudged the car inside. And then the beautiful, bureaucratic music of the universe played out. The garage door closed, the lights flashed, and a chorus of police voices rose up in my driveway. Shouts, orders, and the mechanical clank of handcuffs. In the span of a single breath, my grandson was on his knees and then standing with his palms raised while uniformed officers took him one by one. Jason looked at me. The world narrowed to his eyes and mine. I lifted my chin because that was what Americans do in front of adversity. We don't look down. The officer who took him aside, Deputy Lane, who'd been kind the first time I met him, whispered, "You did right, ma'am." He added it not as consolation, but as fact. They marched the boys to the patrol cars like a procession no one wanted to attend. The old pride in me ached. My grandson's face was young and terrified and entirely human. He didn't even try to put up a fight. Maybe he was empty of the bravado of youth in that moment, or maybe he had finally felt the weight of what he'd tried to do. My neighbors peeked over the fence, a polite assemblage of worry. I gave them nods like semaphore. Then the phone buzzed. Alvarez's voice. "They're moving tonight. Are you ready?" "As I'll ever be," I answered. The plans were as cold and efficient as a legal pad. The officers trailed the boys from the lot, surveilling from 2 blocks over. The plan was for the boys to drive the stolen car,
one of those luxury sedans ripped from a dealer in the next county, up to my street, creep into my driveway, pull into my garage, and leave it there while they disappeared into the night. The officers would move in when the garage door closed, and the boys thought themselves safe. If you ask me whether I was frightened, I'd tell you yes. If you asked whether I thought it was necessary, I'd tell you with the certainty of a widow who's paid property taxes most of her life, absolutely. At 10:12 p.m., headlights rolled onto my street. I watched from the blinds as a sleek black car eased into my driveway like a cat that thinks the porch is hers. My heart hammered. The driver, one of the older boys the detective had been watching, moved like someone who believed he was untouchable. The garage door clicked up, and they nudged the car inside. And then the beautiful, bureaucratic music of the universe played out. The garage door closed, the lights flashed, and a chorus of police voices rose up in my driveway, shouts, orders, and the mechanical clank of handcuffs. In the span of a single breath, my grandson was on his knees and then standing with his palms raised while uniformed officers took him one by one. Jason looked at me. The world narrowed to his eyes and mine. I lifted my chin because that was what Americans do in front of adversity. We don't look down. The officer who took him aside, Deputy Lane, who'd been kind the first time I met him, whispered, "You did right, ma'am." He added it not as consolation, but as fact. They marched the boys to the patrol cars like a procession no one wanted to attend. The old pride in me ached. My grandson's face was young and terrified, and entirely human. He didn't even try to put up a fight. Maybe he was empty of the bravado of youth in that moment, or maybe he had finally felt the weight of what he'd tried to do. My neighbors were out on their porches, some weeping quiet, some whispering, Mrs. Henderson with her hand to her mouth like someone seeing a shipwreck. The detective slipped me a small notebook with a pen. He said, "If you'll write what you saw, we'll need your statement." I wrote until the pen went dry. I wrote about the messages, about the way they'd spoken in whispers in my living room, about the selfie, about the $200 he'd taken from my wallet months earlier, and the way his wrists had trembled when he first put it on the table to make amends. I wrote about the jar of Jingle Bells on the closet doorknob, the cork board, and the lemonade on the Hendersons' porch rail. I wrote because facts matter. Paper is a kind of truth. They loaded the boys into the car. Jason's eyes met mine again, and for the briefest second he mouthed, "I'm sorry." I waved, an old-fashioned little hand wave that said, as plainly as words, "I forgive you, but not forgetting." It went fast after that, processing at the station, fingerprints, the squeak of steel chairs in cold rooms. The detective called me later that night to give me the details. The car had been reported stolen from 2 counties over. The VIN matched a series that had been flagged months earlier. The older boys had outstanding warrants and a rap sheet like a bad novel. Kyle and the Crown boys were likely to face serious charges. They planned to recommend that prosecutors push for harsher penalties given the interstate nature of the thefts and the organized way the gang operated. Jason's fate diagnostically was more complicated. He'd been present. There's no getting around that fact. But he'd cooperated. He'd accepted guardian oversight. He'd tried to stop the plan. That would count for something, the detective said. Whether it would count enough, I didn't know. The law has a way of being precise and not merciful.
When I saw him in the visitation room the next day, he looked smaller. I'd watched him grow, from a chubby baby who drooled on my shoulder to this thin, hard-faced youth who still sometimes tripped on kindness. He looked at me, not angry this time, but exhausted. "You did right," I told him again. He flinched like the words stung, but there was gratitude in his eyes. He whispered, "I didn't mean to." "I know, baby," I said. "I know." There was a trial, as there had been in the earlier scenes of this little legal melodrama. Statements were taken, charges were filed, and somewhere between motion hearings and plea negotiations, I sat and watched the shape of my grandson's future be argued like a thing you could measure on a ledger. The prosecution painted one picture, a pattern of behavior, a youth who'd had chances and squandered them. The defense painted another, a vulnerable kid manipulated by older men, a community that had failed him, an opportunity for rehabilitation. The truth was both. The truth is rarely a neat box. When the judge handed down the decision, Jason would not go to prison this time either. My knees shook. He'd been given a suspended sentence with heavy probation, mandatory community service, and, in a twist I hadn't expected, a court order stating that his grandmother, me, was to be his legal guardian with more explicit authority and oversight than before. The judge explained that the court favored a rehabilitative approach for young offenders with mitigating circumstances, especially when a stable guardian was willing to provide structure and supervision. If you'd asked me in the visiting room whether I felt lucky, I'd have said yes with a breathy laugh. But luck is a complicated thing. Jason didn't realize how lucky he was. Not then. He still thought the world owed him something for having been born. He didn't see that the universe had tossed him a lifeline and wrapped it in a court order. He resented the constraints. He resented me. "I'm your guardian legally now," I reminded him the night the judge signed the papers, as if the seal on a document could be a hug. He said nothing. He slid his phone into a drawer and stared at the wall. He didn't yet understand that the court's decision, the cops' planning, the detectives' interviews, and my stubborn vigilance had given him a second chance that men twice his age would sweat to buy. He didn't understand the quiet miracle in the judge's words. "We're keeping you out of a cell so you can live." Most kids don't notice miracles when they're handed in government-issue manila folders. The arrest in my garage changed things in ways both immediate and subtle. We had more monitoring from probation. Alvarez came by more often with forms and lists and a stern smile. Jason's friends either drifted away or were locked into their own battles. The older boys' arrests meant less pressure on my street, at least for a while. But it also meant other people in the justice system were watching him like hawks circling a field mouse. After the courtroom drama, people in town started to speak about us differently. Some saw a grandmother who saved her boy. Others saw a woman who'd testified against teenagers and set a snare. I was both. I was the woman who'd sat in an overstuffed chair and heard plotting whispers and did something about it. I was also the woman whose grandchild had to face the consequences of choices. Both things can be true at once. He came home on probation, lugging a duffel bag of clothing and a head full of resentments. He moved more quietly through the house than I remembered. He watched me make coffee the way one watches a ritual you don't yet understand. I watched him trudge through his chores with the same stubbornness he'd always had when he meant to finish something. And then one evening, months after the arrests, an odd thing happened. He washed the dishes without being asked. He packed his school bag without slumping it into a corner. He stood at my kitchen sink and, for no apparent reason, looked at me and said, "You know, Grandma, I'm tired." "Tired?" I repeated. "Tired of running. Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of being that kid. I want—" He stopped, searching for the word. Something different. "You could have knocked me over with a feather." "What's that look like?" I asked. He thought for a long time. "Not waking up at night with my heart pounding, thinking about where to hide from people. Not being scared to buy tools. Maybe getting good at a thing and keeping a job."
That, my friends, is the small, stubborn miracle. The day a person stops wanting to run. It's not cinematic. There's no thunderclap. It's just a quiet rearrangement, like moving a chair to face the window. We kept at it. Classes, service hours, notices, the amends account filling slowly but surely. He did not become an angel overnight. He missed curfew once because a bus broke down.
He lied about an extra hour at work one Friday. He sulked like the moon has phases. But he also went to therapy, begrudgingly at first, then with a dawning sense that talking didn't make him small. A good therapist will teach a teenager that some things are worth trading for a life that doesn't hurt people. One bright afternoon when the garage door stood open and the air smelled faintly of cut grass, I found his old hoodie folded neatly on the workbench next to the torque wrench he'd bought with part of his grant money. He'd tacked a small note to it that said simply, "For when I forget who I am." I cried into my apron like a child. We made it thus far because of stubbornness and paperwork and lemon bars. We made it because the law sometimes chooses to be a scaffold rather than a cage. We made it because a small town still has the decency to show up when it sees someone trying, even if they mess up the first dozen steps. And just when he thought he had me backed into a corner, he forgot who he was dealing with. Stick with me, because you'll want to see how this plays out. There was still a final act to play, one that would test everything we'd built. The Crown Boys were still out there, and the older men who'd used them were like weeds in a garden. You can pull them out, but roots sometimes remain. The law had done its work, but life's work is slower. It takes time, patience, and the willingness to keep lighting small lamps in dark places. We had a decent life again. Not perfect, but real and honest, and more importantly, lived. The arrest in my garage had been a jolt, an ugly, necessary jolt. But in the aftermath, something hard and beautiful grew. Boundaries. And with boundaries comes the chance to keep someone you love from making the same mistakes twice. He didn't realize how lucky he'd been, how many hands had held him up when his legs shook. He thought for a while that the world would owe him redemption because he'd asked for it. It doesn't work that way. Redemption is a hard-earned stipend you cash in with time and sweat. We were living the payback. The final chapter, the courtroom twist you won't believe, and the verdict that changes everything comes next. He was about to get exactly what he deserved, and I had a front row seat. Don't go anywhere. The week after the arrests in my garage, my house smelled like coffee and copier ink. I had papers spread across the dining table like a jigsaw puzzle whose picture finally made sense. Receipts, screen grabs, incident numbers, then printouts, and my neat little ledger with amends on the cover in Sharpie. I always joked that motherhood is logistics. Turns out, so is justice. A call came from the county attorney's office asking if I'd sit for one more interview. The detective wanted me to walk them through the paper trail, how I'd gotten from jingle bells on a closet door to a manila envelope fat enough to wedge under a door. I brought the binder and my reading glasses on a string. The young assistant prosecutor had a haircut that looked like he asked for responsible on the sides, righteous on top. He said, "Ma'am, this is thorough." I'm a church secretary by training. I once found a missing baptism certificate from 1978 in a box marked election decorations. I know where people hide what they don't want to lose. They chuckled, and then we got to work. Here's what the grown-ups did, and pay attention because this is the part no one puts on TV. They connected my tidy little notes to other people's big, messy lives. They pulled reports from 2 counties where cars had gone missing. They matched my crown tattooed gentleman to 3 aliases and 1 probation violation. They found the auto body shop's owner, Mr. Holcomb of Holcomb's Custom Auto, the sweatshirt logo, and traced payments through a tangle of shell invoices that would have made a spider dizzy. They cross-referenced cell phone pings with security camp timestamps and, bless those new porch cameras, license plates my neighbors had started catching since I'd handed out flyers.
It wasn't CSI, it was clipboards and patience.
The county didn't charge my grandson as a mastermind. He wasn't. They didn't throw the book at him as if he'd been born knowing how to file off a VIN. They did, however, look at the older men who had been fattening themselves on boys like mine. The prosecutor told me there's not a fancy name for this in our state, no RICO parade, but there are statutes about chop shops, interstate transport of stolen property, conspiracy, and, my personal favorite, maintaining a public nuisance. That last one sounds old-fashioned until you watch it pull down a shingle. We weren't done with the Crown boys either. Kyle and Red were charged alongside the older men. Kyle caved early and took a plea. Red mouthed off and then hired a lawyer who put him in a tie and told him not to blink. It's funny how all that Crown swagger fits so neatly into a pawns box when the stakes change. While the big wheels started to turn, I kept my little world tidy. Jason and I met with Alvarez twice a week. He logged hours at the county fleet, learning how to change oil the way a doctor learns to check a pulse, by touch and habit. He went to therapy where he talked about his father's silence and my ham sandwiches and the time he swiped a wallet at 13 just to see if he could. He mowed the Hendersons' lawn and, unprompted, asked if he could edge the walkway before their granddaughter's wedding photos. Mrs. Henderson cried into a tea towel and said, "Yes, please, God bless you." Then, like a summertime thunderhead, a letter arrived. Notice of hearing, nuisance abatement, Holcomb's Custom Auto, City Hall, 7 p.m., public welcome. Bring your documentation, the clerk had handwritten at the bottom like frosting on a cake. I put on my good shoes and packed the binder. We sat in those hard municipal chairs under the gaze of 3 framed portraits of mayors, whose haircuts each had their decade. The city attorney called the meeting to order. I'd never been in that room for anything but a zoning squabble about pergolas. That night, the air had teeth. They laid out the case like a quilt. Police reports, neighbor complaints about noise at 2 a.m., a list of vehicles seen going in and out after hours, citations for oil runoff into the storm drain, a fire inspection report noting padlocked exits and gasoline cans stored like party decorations. Then they called me. "Mrs. Carter," the city attorney said, smiling like you do in church when you recognize someone who always brings potato salad. I walked to the podium and placed my right hand on nothing but my own promise to tell the truth. I told them about the note on the Hendersons' door, "Run," and the nights I sat asleep in my recliner while boys whispered like villains in a cheap movie. I told them about my $200 and the stupid selfie. I told them about bells on closets and a flip phone that dials justice faster than gossip spreads at the beauty parlor. I told them about the car in my garage and the way my grandson's face looked when the door came up and a sea of flashlights turned night into consequence. Then I opened the binder and gave City Hall the gospel according to a grandmother. Dates, times, names, license plates, receipts. I am not here to punish, because I believe it. I am here to protect. I am here because men with toolboxes full of bad ideas saw a neighborhood where old women sit on porches and thought, no one here will stop us. They were wrong. We stopped them. Together. You could have heard a bingo ball drop. Holcomb himself showed up with a lawyer who objected to everything but the oxygen. He stood and lied as if he thought the room was his. He said he ran a respectable shop. He said he had no idea what those boys were doing after hours. He said he'd been targeted by a smear campaign cooked up by nosy neighbors and a cop with a vendetta. Bless the city attorney. She let him run for a minute and then snapped the leash. "Sir, the door camera footage from Mrs. Patel's bakery across the block shows your employee, this gentleman with the crown tattoo, opening your gate at midnight to admit a stolen vehicle 2 days after it was reported missing. You'll forgive us if we find your bakery customer service hours unusual." They voted to suspend Holcomb's business license pending the criminal case. They also moved to levy daily fines for the code violations and ordered him to install cameras that fed directly to a third party. The fire marshal closed his back bay until the padlocks were replaced with panic bars, and the environmental inspector had a field day with his storm drains.
It wasn't handcuffs. It was worse. It was expensive.
I walked out of City Hall with my binder hugged to my chest, and the Hendersons walked with me like an honor guard. Mr. Henderson squeezed my shoulder. "You did us proud," he said. "You did this block proud." I don't know if I did. I just showed up. Sometimes that's 90% of justice. Show up with a notebook. Now, I know this part is hard to hear, but it's important. The truth was about to come out, and it was going to be glorious. The criminal case ground forward with all the greasy weight of the system, but it ground. Kyle took a plea and gave up names like a tree loses leaves in a storm. Red tried to play hardball, then folded when he saw the jury list included two of his mother's co-workers. The older men, the ones who had passed envelopes and taught boys how to lift SUVs onto dollies, got the kind of multi-count indictments that read like a bad catalog. One pled. One went to trial and lost. Holcomb copped to a lesser offense, surrendered the shop's license for 5 years, and paid a mountain of fines that would refurbish our library's roof 3 times over. As part of restitution, the court set up a fund for victims, prioritized by demonstrable harm. You better believe I had demonstrable up to my eyeballs. I turned in a packet for the Hendersons, the cost of their new door cameras, the increase in their insurance premiums, the fancy deadbolt their arthritic fingers needed a lever handle for. I included my own light item for the $200, not because I needed it, but because a ledger without the first theft is a story missing its first line. The judge approved every penny, plus a little for incidental distress, which felt like the universe tipping its hat. The court also did something I didn't expect. It recognized the amends fund I'd set up as a voluntary mechanism and folded it into Jason's probation. 15% of all earnings shall be directed to the amends account for restitution and community benefit, the order read. I framed the page and put it on the wall by the corkboard. Jason looked at it like a man regards a portrait of himself he isn't sure he deserves. Community benefit meant we got to be creative. With Mr. Henderson's input and Mrs. Henderson's very firm opinions about benches, Jason designed and built a little seating nook at the bus stop by the bakery, complete with a covered box that held a take a book, leave a bookshelf. That was my condition. If my boy learned to fix cars on the public dime, he'd also improve a spot where teenagers linger and grandmothers wait. He chose oak and sealant. He sanded it smooth. He engraved a tiny plaque with a wrench and a heart. I cried, again, because grief and joy live in the same cupboard at my age, and they share spoons. Midway through all this, we got to the hearing for Jason's formal sentencing. The hearing, the one that would make official what had been provisional, the one I promised you since the beginning. Suspended sentence, community service, and the additional condition that I become his legal guardian with enhanced authority. We wore our good clothes and our nerves on the inside. Jason's lawyer, a legal aide with a spine like a yardstick, stood and told the court who Jason had been and who he was trying to be. Alvarez testified and didn't sugarcoat. She said he stumbled and got up. The Hendersons came and said they'd rather have a neighbor mowing their lawn at dawn than a stranger creeping at midnight. The detective looked at Jason and said, he cooperated. That matters. Then the judge spoke. And friends, let me tell you, some people were born to wear a robe. She looked at my grandson not like a threat or a statistic, but like a wayward lamb who'd wandered back within earshot. Mr. Carter, she said, each word a cornerstone, I am sentencing you to a suspended term of incarceration. In place of prison, you will serve community service totaling 1,000 hours. You will continue in counseling, you will remain in school or employed, and you will live under the guardianship of your grandmother, Mrs. Carter, who is hereby granted full authority to enforce curfew, monitor your associates, and approve your expenditures. Violate any of these terms and your suspended sentence will be imposed. Do you understand? Jason swallowed. Yes, Your Honor. She didn't stop there. You will also present to this court in 6 months a portfolio of your community benefit projects and a ledger of your amends account. You will explain to this court not just what you have done, but what you have learned. Do you understand?
By the end of the year, the judge signed off on Jason's probation compliance. The suspended sentence still hung over him, like a portrait of past mistakes, but it was fading into the gallery of lessons. He had a part-time job at a reputable shop. The owner came to our oil change Saturdays and stole him with an offer he'd earned, and a spot in the fall at the community college's advanced program. The amends fund crossed a threshold that made me clap my hands like a child. We sat at the kitchen table and wrote a check to the Hendersons that settled the restitution balance. Jason slid it across their coffee table with both hands. Mr. Henderson didn't even look at the amount. He slid it back. "Put it toward your tools," he said. "Your penance is paid in full." Jason looked stunned. "But—" "No buts," Mrs. Henderson said. "You already paid us back the best way. You came when we called, you showed up when we expected you, and you made the corner safer for the next kid." I swallowed my heart and made tea strong enough to float a horseshoe. On the anniversary of the night I left the run note on their door, Jason did something that felt like a circle closing. He gave me a note. Taped to the fridge, that same block lettering he once used for trouble, now scribbled for peace. It said, "Rest. I've got it." He'd done the dishes, balanced the amends ledger, and taped the receipt from the parts store, $42.16, underneath. I added a magnet shaped like a sunflower and left it there until the corners curled. We never posted that stupid selfie he took with my wallet. We did take another one, though. My idea. We stood on the porch with the Hendersons. Jason held the torque wrench across his shoulders like a stole. I held the binder like scripture. We smiled into the sun. The caption, for me, not the internet, was "Owned Up." And that's the real revenge, if you're looking for it. Not humiliation, not a gotcha reel, not a doorstep confrontation with a camera rolling. The revenge was financial, legal, and, most satisfying of all, educational. We shut down a shop that chewed up boys. We turned fines into library shingles. We turned a courthouse order into a neighborhood bench where my friend Gloria now sits to wait for the bus with her knees not screaming. We turned a crown into a cautionary tale. We turned a boy with a talent for bad timing into a young man with hands that fix things and a head that sleeps. People still ask me sometimes, at church, at the grocery store, online, whether I regret calling the police on my own blood. I tell them the truth. I regret that I ever had to. But I don't regret protecting my neighbors. I don't regret choosing the kind of love that bites. I don't regret a single phone call. And I don't regret sleeping in that chair. Eyes closed, ears open. They thought I was deaf and out of my mind. Turns out, I was wide awake. If you made it this far with me, thank you. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my place?
You are watched to the end. Be click here. You will hear another story from my grandma.